Right, so this is really a quick run through of things that I think are really cool in CSS that have either landed in browsers very recently or that are coming soon. And this is a talk that I update kind of regularly. And the nice thing, every time I update it, some of the things that were coming soon have now landed in browsers, and then some new things are coming soon. So it's kind of exciting. We've got a lot of CSS coming into browsers at quite a high speed at the moment, which is really great as web developers to be able to play with all this new stuff. So the things I'll be showing you, most of them, even the things that are coming soon, have got some implementation behind a flag or whatever that you can play around with, so you can see, you know, what's happening. So we'll start with some things that actually are everywhere now, or pretty much everywhere. When we got CSS Grid, we got the gap feature, gap, column gap, and row gap, to define the gaps between rows and columns in a grid layout. Really useful. The column gap feature also appears in multiple column layouts to give you gaps between columns. Now, while you can use margins to space out grid items as well, if you want to, the nice thing about the gap feature is that you only get gaps kind of in the inside of the tracks. You don't get a gap on the edge, which is what you do if you use a margin. You don't know how many columns you've got. And using margins is typically what we've done with Flexbox in order to create that gap between flex items. So you end up with something like this, where we're using a margin on the flex items, and then we're using a negative margin on the container to kind of get rid of that outside margin, which tends to work. It's a bit of a kludge. So once you've got the gap in Flexbox, we can just use the gap property on the container, just like we do with Grid, and then we get the gaps in between flex items and don't have to do anything weird on the outside. So that's really cool, and that is something which is now shipping in major browsers, have all got the gap property for Flexbox. Now, this Flexbox Gap implementation actually sort of highlights some interesting things. You might remember, if you were a really early adopter of grid layout and were excited about it early on, that when it first was introduced, you would find the properties grid gap, grid row gap, and grid column gap, so prefixed with grid. They actually shipped with the grid specification when it first appeared in browsers. The thing is, it turned out that gap was obviously quite useful. We wanted it in Flexbox, and what we don't want to do is kind of have redundancy to have a flex gap property and a grid gap property and then a whatever else gap property that comes along in the future. So they were renamed to be more generic, so they could be used in lots of different layout methods. So you can now use the unprefixed properties in Grid wherever it's supported, and the older properties are used as an alias. They've actually been moved into the box alignment specification, which is where all of the nice alignment stuff that originally showed up in Flexbox is specified. And so gaps are kind of part of that specification because it deals with things like space distribution, which gaps kind of are. As I say, the grid dash properties were maintained as aliases. You will find them in lots of tutorials. You may well have some in production code, and it's fine. They'll kind of live forevermore. So things aren't suddenly going to start breaking. They won't get removed, I wouldn't have thought. We tend not to break the web, even if things were only around for a short amount of time. So say most major browsers have got the gap property. What we don't see it in, all the Chromium based things will update eventually as they update their Chromium version they're based off. We don't yet have it in Safari, although it has been put into WebKit, so it's in the technology preview. So it will eventually get into Safari. And just really as a note about that, you might think, well, can we detect Flexbox Gap with feature queries? But unfortunately, we can't. It's a bit of an edge case, because with feature queries, we can do things like this. We can say, at support display grid. Does the browser support display grid? And then do our grid things. But what we can't do is ask for support in a layout method. So whereas we can say @supports gap, all of the browsers support gap because they support grid. But they don't support gap in Flexbox. I did raise an issue on the CSS working group to ask if it would be possible to kind of have a support this feature along with this other feature, but it's kind of difficult because all those feature queries do is does the browser parse this? They're sort of fairly basic. So it's quite a hard thing to do anything more clever than that, really. So it may be something we just have to live with. But that's a bit of good news. We're sort of getting there with Gap, and hopefully we're going to see that in Safari soon as well. I think that just tidies up a lot of bits of CSS. Another kind of nice tidying up thing, and something which has been a problem for years, is styling list bullets. Now, it used to be pretty much impossible to just style a list bullet because you had to style the text and the marker as all one thing. So you'd kind of, you want to be able to just target that marker, and that's what we can do with the marker pseudo element. So we can actually get at the marker as an independent box away from the content. So that would give us something like this. We can have our text white and our marker black without having to do anything weird like wrap a span around the actual text and style that up. That's now in Chrome and Firefox. And also markers are quite cool. You can do interesting things with markers outside of list elements. So for instance, you could turn a heading into a list item with display list item, which will give you a marker. And then in your marker, you could use generated content to give yourself a marker like that. So I've used an emoji there. So you could use the marker property, the marker pseudo element to do some interesting things. So that's markers. Again, that's something which is in browsers now. And again, tidying things up. People often ask me what I'm most excited about in CSS. And although obviously the big things like, grid layout is really exciting, these things that have been a pain for like every web developer forever that get tidied up are really neat. And aspect ratios are one of those things. Some things have an aspect ratio we want to preserve. Now, if you put an image or a video directly onto your page, we preserve the aspect ratio. It doesn't get stretched in weird ways. But if you want to embed a video from YouTube, it's very difficult to preserve that aspect ratio because you can have a flexible width for the video, but then what about the height? We've dealt with this via a sort of a quirk of CSS using the padding hack. And that uses the fact that padding in the block direction is copied from the inline direction when we use a percentage. It's not a very elegant solution to the problem, but it works. It's how we've dealt with aspect ratio boxes for a very long time. That's going to change, or is changing, with the aspect ratio unit. We can solve that by allowing us to specify an aspect ratio for a length. You can have great fun with this in grid layout by giving your grid items an aspect ratio, which means that they can then become exactly square. So I'm using that grid template columns autofill, which is going to give me flexible columns. So I don't actually know exactly how wide they're going to be. They're going to be at least 250 pixels, but they could be a bit bigger depending on how much space there is. But without an aspect ratio, I'd have to kind of fix the height and kind of guess at more or less what would make them square. If I use aspect ratio, I can say aspect ratio, and here I'm using 1/1 because I want it to be a square box. I want them to be the same. And that gives me something like this. So each of those are entirely square boxes, which I've then used to transform for a bit of fun on. So this is something which is shipping. It's in Chrome. There's parts of it are in Firefox. It's coming out into browsers now, so we can start to actually have proper aspect ratio boxes rather than having to do sort of weird things. And I always think that web developers in the future are going to look back at some of the odd stuff that we were doing to get basic layouts to work and wonder what on earth was going on. One of the neat things about this, and something which is very well supported, going quite a few versions back in browsers, this property was initially implemented internally by browsers. And if you use a width and a height on your HTML image element, it will be used to calculate an aspect ratio before the image loads, which will stop the horrible jiggly around thing as images start to load in on a long page, once someone started to scroll, because the space will be reserved. So basically what will happen is that the browser will look at the width and work out the aspect ratio and actually sort of figure it all out so that you don't get that horrible jiggly thing. You get the sort of placeholder space before the image comes in. So it's definitely worth, if you've got images in your HTML that you didn't bother putting a width and height on, it's worth going and putting those in, because that actually is a visible performance improvement for the user to not have that weird jiggliness going on. So that's some stuff you can start using now. There's obviously some browser issues going back, but a lot of this stuff can be used as an enhancement, which is cool. I'm going to move on to some stuff which is kind of starting to show up in browsers as a bit less support. Some of those things I think are really good. There's some really great stuff happening in CSS color, in the CSS color spec. And here, these functions, color mix and color contrast, they're both in Safari Technology Preview. Color mix is also behind a flag in Firefox. So color mix lets you mix two colors. So the first value there is the color space you're mixing in. Then you've got a color and a percentage of how much of the first color you want mixed with the second. So here I've got a sort of a blue mixing in with white. And sort of here you can see you mix a bit more, and obviously you get more blue as you go through. So that's a really neat function for allowing you to use one color and have different values of it. It's the sort of thing we've been doing in SAS and so on, but actually right there in your CSS. There's also color contrast. This is really interesting because it lets you take a color and then a list of other colors, and from the list the browser will pick the one that will give you the highest contrast with the first color. So that's again a useful function because it lets you, if you for some reason have dynamic colors in your application, maybe it's something where the user can select their own color, in a CMS or whatever, being able to then have the browser select the best color for the text that's on top of that could be really handy. And you then have some control that they were still, in keeping with what you want, but giving something back to the browser there. So yeah, lots of new stuff coming in color. The color spec is something to watch out for because a lot of those things are getting implemented quite quickly. And then we have Masonry, which is part of the CSS Grid level 3 spec. When Grid shipped, a lot of people were like, oh, it looks like we can do Masonry with this, and tried to do Masonry, and then realized it wasn't quite going to give them a Masonry or Pinterest style layout. And just to make sure people know what I'm talking about, I think the term is fairly common, but a Masonry layout is like what you have on Pinterest. And in a Masonry layout, items display by row, so you fill up in rows rather than columns. Once the first row is filled, the new items populate another row, but if some of the items in that first row are short, the ones in the second row kind of rise up to fill the gap. So it's a bit of a mixture between what Grid and Flexbox do. But it's a very common layout method. It's something which doesn't perform very well when you do it with JavaScript. So level 3 of the grid spec defines this Masonry layout for one axis of the grid. So you can set up, say, a 4-column grid, and then you say you want your rows to behave like masonry. And that then gives you something like that. So that's a Masonry layout done with CSS Grid. You can play around with this. You'll need to use Firefox Nightly and enable the flag there to let you turn that on and have a play around with it. But it's pretty straightforward. It just sort of works as you'd expect, and you can do a lot of the other griddy type things with your layout. So I think that'll be really nice once that gets into browsers, because again, it'll bring a real performance enhancement because those type of layouts do not perform very well when they're done with JavaScript. And I've written some stuff there and with some demos on Smashing Magazine, which again, if you enable the flags, you can play around with. And really, while we're with Grid, in fact, level 2 of the Grid spec includes Subgrid. I'm not going to talk too much about Subgrid because there's a lot of information. If you search for Subgrid, you'll find my stuff and lots of other people's stuff online. But Subgrid basically means you can inherit the track sizing and number of tracks down through the sort of grandchildren of a grid item. So it means you can declare a grid, for all of your layout and have things that are nested down in the structure still work to that grid, which is pretty useful. Again, this is in Firefox. They've implemented this, so you can try it out. I've got lots of examples there on Grid by Example. You can go and use a copy of Firefox and have a look at how Subgrid works. Now, this is going to come to Chromium before too long, hopefully. So it's in Firefox. It's pretty solid as a spec. It's pretty well sort of worked out. It works pretty well. It's relatively simple on top of the standard grid stuff. The holdup really with Chromium is that the Chrome have been sort of replacing their layout engine in their browser. So they're having to rewrite everything so it works with what's called layout ng. And this obviously takes quite a lot of time. And they weren't going to implement Subgrid on top of the old engine. They were going to wait until Grid was in the new engine and then implement it. The Microsoft team are working on the re-implementation of Grid. Last I heard, it was fairly well progressed. And so as part of that work, they're going to also implement Subgrid. So it is on its way to Chromium and then therefore Edge and all the other Chromium-based browsers, which is pretty exciting. And here's another little feature. We've got all these media features which test for things that the user wants, sort of user preferences. This is one of them. This prefers reduced data. If your user has enabled data saving in their device, you could adjust the website accordingly. You know, don't load any huge images. So it's just like this, prefers reduced data, the user's not set a preference, and then you can get on and download your images. This one's in Chrome Canary. You need to enable experimental web platform features, and then you can emulate a person browsing with data saving enabled using DevTools. I really like the fact that a lot of these new features sort of come, their implementation also comes with DevTools, so we can play around with it. That's really cool. So there's a whole bunch of these things like prefers color scheme, prefers reduced motion, which are already shipped. There's going to be lots more of these things that help us really tailor the experience for our users based on what they've said they want in their device. You know, in their browser, they've said they want a certain thing, they don't want a certain thing, and then we can really help them out by using these media features rather than just looking at how big is the screen, which these days doesn't really tell you very much about what the user wants because the sort of device we've got are so varied. Okay, and here's something we can't yet try out, but it's really cool. And again, one of those things that fixes a problem people have had. If you've tried to line up different fonts, different typefaces and so on, you've probably very quickly discovered that there's a different amount of white space around the outside of different fonts, and you can't do very much about it. The leading trim property will give you the opportunity to trim off the extra space. It's probably going to look something like this. This is a very new spec. And so you're going to be able to say you want to trim off the space top and bottom of that text. The example came from this article, which is brilliant, and it explains the whole issue. It explains why we have this situation, of extra space around typefaces, and how the property is going to help us solve it. So that's definitely something that's worth having a look at if you've ever been frustrated by typography and getting things to line up nicely. And so that's something that is sort of being developed at the moment by the working groups. And there are also links in that article to how you can offer feedback if typography is something you know a lot about and you sort of have thoughts on reading this, do offer your feedback. And something else that we really want feedback on, container queries. I've been talking about CSS layout for many years, and all of that time people have been saying, when are we going to get container queries? And for a long time, it was kind of, this is too hard. And not even that it's too hard, that it's just going to cause too many potential performance problems. Generally, when people in working groups push back on features that everybody seems to want, it's not because we hate the web and don't want to give you things that you want to use. It's because they're going to cause problems and browsers probably won't implement them because of those problems. And there's no point as having a spec if all the browsers say, nope, we're not doing that. So that was the problem with container queries. It was kind of something that was deemed to be very, very difficult to get to work in a performant way. However, things have moved on. We've got, browser engines are better, and also we've got other specifications that things can kind of stand on top of, and that's what's happening with container queries. It's going to be, it's going to be part of CSS containment, which exists already as a way to define part of your page which is separate from everything else, is kind of contained, everything in it is separate and doesn't, for instance, need to be repainted when something else changes. So that's there for performance reasons. There's sort of a bunch of people, including Miriam Suzanne's done a lot of work on this, who realize that actually this could probably be used to create container queries, because we can say this thing is contained and therefore use its size, you know, as the thing to do our query off. So here we're saying contain layout inline size. At the moment, the experimental implementation just does inline size. So essentially width in horizontal writing mode. And then we can use that because we've got something we've defined containment on, we've said it's a container. We can then use an @container query, just like a media query, but rather than checking for the width of the viewport, we're looking for the width of that element. Dead simple. And it, you know, it works. There's an experimental implementation in Chrome, and you can play around with it. So I've started to document this. You need to enable the container queries flag in Chrome Canary to be able to play with it. But please do, you know, please take a look at what is upcoming there and see if it would solve your use cases, see if it would work for the sort of things that you want container queries for. And that's really a good point, just to move on to the last part of my talk. And that's really just to say that anyone can get involved with this stuff. And the reason that I talk to people about things that you can't use in production yet is because I want other people to feel empowered to contribute to specifications and to the whole process, because that makes the web better for all of us. There's a really great site, the Web Platform Contribution Guide, which tells you all of the different ways you can get involved with the web platform and contribute things. So obviously a really simple way is what I've already mentioned on a couple of those features is, you know, just raise issues about specifications or look at the issues already raised and see if you've got any comments. So, you know, container queries, there's a whole load. If you go to the MDN article, I've got links to, you know, all of the different issues that are currently being discussed. So you can go and have a look and see if you've got any thoughts on those. You know, here's all of the CSS working group issues are on GitHub, just like any other open source projects. You can go and you can see what things are being discussed and add your thoughts. You will be very, very welcome to do so. It's great. We're often trying to get comments from other web developers because most spec authors aren't actually web developers themselves, and certainly not full-time web developers. So having lots of sort of input from the community is really important. If you're raising a new issue or you're commenting on an existing one, being able to explain the use case you've got for the feature is really important. So just like you were suggesting a feature for a bit of software that you use, you know, you sort of explain why you need it, the problem it would solve. Do the same with the web platform. If you're already using JavaScript particularly CSS, you're using JavaScript to solve a problem, and you think that there should be a CSS way of doing it, that is a really good starting point, because you can say, hey, look, we have to do this. It causes a performance problem. It would be great if CSS had a property that did that. And that's where something like Masonry layout came from, that people were having to do that with JavaScript, didn't perform very well. Can we do that in CSS? If something you suggest needs discussion in the CSS working group, which typically things do, unless you're just, you know, saying there's a typo in that spec, which please do if you spot them. But if something needs discussion, then it will come up in either our weekly meeting or eventually when we can meet face-to-face in our face-to-face discussion. All of those things are logged in IRC, and then the IRC log is posted back to the issue, so you can see when it's been discussed. And we don't ever close issues unless they are really very silly or spam, you know. We don't close them without discussing them. So, you know, your thing will get raised. However, it will probably take longer than you think for that to happen. You might hit lucky. I mean, if you come and comment on container queries, it will probably get discussed very soon because that is actively being worked on. But if you come and comment on a spec that hasn't got anyone working on it right now, it might be a while before it kind of rises to the top. You know, there's not actually that many spec editors and they all work on lots of specs. So, you know, when that thing rises to the top, You know, I work on multi-call, and I've got lots of issues raised against multi-call level 2, which once I get multi-call level 1 back to CR, I'll then start looking at. So some of those have sat around for a while. You know, we're not forgetting about them. It just sometimes takes a while to actually get round to things. Things that can actually make a difference more quickly, you know, raising browser bugs. If you find a browser bug and you know, go and log it with the browsers. We've got all this new stuff coming in so quickly that quite often bugs do happen, just like in any software. If you're using something in combination with something else, you might be the first person to really be doing that to any great degree. So if you find a bug, do go and raise it with the browser. And really the key thing there is to learn to create a reduced test case. Create the smallest possible thing that shows your bug, and either put it somewhere like on CodePen or JS Fiddle or somewhere like that, or upload the files to the bug. And the reason I say that is what happens is sometimes people come along and say, you can see this on my website. But then by the time an engineer comes to look at it, you've changed your website and the bug isn't in evidence anymore. So having something which is there as a permanent record of this is the bug at this point is really handy. You know, the bug trackers are useful to go to. You can also star issues that you care about, which will mean you get a notification when it changes. And it sort of shows that you're interested. There's another person interested in this feature. And then also, you know, just test and offer feedback on stuff behind flags. You know, when I say container queries is behind a flag, please go and look at it and make sure it works for the stuff you want. Because once things get out into production in browsers, we can't ever take them back, which is why the CSS working group has this list. This is the list of things, of mistakes in CSS that we're only going to be able to fix if we invent a time machine, because we can't break the web. And so we really don't want to end up with more of these, and the more feedback we get on features, the fewer of these we're going to have. And also, really, just to wrap this up, the other way we're trying to stop having features that aren't so great is that now there's a whole suite of web platform tests. Every spec is supposed to have, all of the spec text should have a test, so that browsers can come along and make sure that their engine works with the spec and does all the right things for the spec. So those things can be added to by anyone. If you like writing JavaScript, then they're very, very straightforward to write. Some of them don't even use JavaScript. Some of them are just, does this thing look like that thing? And so you can make those quite easily. So contributing tests to specs that haven't got a lot of tests yet is a really, really useful way to help if you want to help with the platform. So there's a bunch of ways you can help move things along even faster and to get involved. But, you know, do engage the process. Even if you're not commenting all the time, it can be quite interesting just to see what is coming through. There's loads of interesting stuff happening. And it's quite enjoyable to get involved. You learn a lot by getting involved as well, by actually sort of seeing the inner workings of it all. So I hope that's been useful and sort of given you a bit of excitement about what is to come. And thank you very much for listening.